This is Transqat. What is Transqat? Transqat is a safe space. It's a place for respectful conversations about transgender issues. It's a place for queer people to come tell their stories. I'm host Claire McCarthy. Welcome to Transqat. For most of us, politics is a spectator sport. We choose a team, we root for our colors, we obsess over the standings in the polls, and we boo the ref when we don't like a call. But that's all a distraction. It's not what politics really is. It's just how the marketing execs sell it to us. The task of a politician, once elected, is to govern, to legislate, not to posture and demagogue, not to build a cult of personality. The question is simple. What will you, as an elected official, actually do to better the lives of your constituents? Barney Frank understands this better than most. Frank was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives back in 1972, just 3 years after Stonewall. He was a U.S. Congressman from 1981 to 2013. He was the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, and he co-sponsored the Dodd-Frank Act in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Barney was the first member of Congress to voluntarily come out. He was the first member of Congress to marry someone of the same sex while in office. He was, to quote the title of Stuart Weisberg's 2009 biography, America's only left-handed gay Jewish congressman. But Barney Frank was so much more than that. Those of us he represented remember well that he was, as a survey by Washingtonian magazine declared, the brainiest, funniest, most eloquent member of Congress. For 3 decades, Barney Frank was this country's leading advocate for improving the lives of LGBTQ+ Americans. He did the work. He counted the votes. And he took the heat when the community thought he hadn't done enough and when opposition thought he had done too much. And no matter how loudly the spectators booed, Barney Frank knew that, as Teddy Roosevelt said, the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena. It was a privilege to sit down via Zoom with Barney Frank, and I am well beyond happy to share this conversation with you. Regular listeners will recall that last season I spoke with political cartoonist Eric Orner about his graphic novel Smart Guy. And in the course of that conversation, we both said some really complimentary things about the protagonist of his book, Congressman Barney Frank. Here with a rebuttal is Congressman Barney Frank.
You're welcome. Actually, the way you introduced it reminds me of a great line from, I think it was James Thurber. Someone came up, who's a great humorist, he wrote for the New Yorker, and a woman came up to him and said, "Oh, Mr. Thurber, I read your last book in French. It was very funny." He said, "Oh, yes, I lose a lot in the original." So maybe that's where I hope we'll avoid.
Let me start with that book. It takes, I've got to imagine, a degree of trust and of courage to trust your story to someone who caricatures for a living.
As a public figure, given the state of law in America as it should be, I have no control over what anybody wants to write about me or how anyone wants to depict me. In Eric's case, of course, I would have the option of not cooperating. In Eric's case, he was someone I'd known for, 20 years or more. Actually, I'd met him in Boston. We were working out at the same gym. He expressed his interest in politics, and at first, he volunteered to drive me around. You need, when you're campaigning or meeting your constituents, someone to drive you. But he was obviously very bright. He was a lawyer. And so he went to work for me, and he went to work. He left to do other stuff. He came back. So I knew him very well, and I knew we were very simpatico, ideologically, and personally. So there was really no risk.
What was your reaction? I'm assuming you've read the book.
Yeah, it was very flattering. I was touched by it. My first reaction, I must say, was I was impressed at the amount of work he put into it. I knew he did a lot of research. I'd met with him several times, but just the physical act of drawing that many panels and getting likenesses is very good. I mean, it's leaving aside the content about me, it's an incredibly impressive work of graphic art. It does, I think, It treats me very fairly, very well, because Eric and I do share an ideological commitment. I think that was important that he was able to get that across, why I was doing some of the things I was doing.
As a result of having read his book, I sat down and read yours and learned a lot of things about the behind the scenes of historical moments in LGBTQ rights history that I understood only as a consumer of news. The major theme, I think, of your book there is that this trend that started with Reagan of government is the enemy is wrong and needs to be fought. Well, let me ask you to start there, if I could.
No, there's no question. You're quite right about that. And, Reagan is a severe break with things. If you go back to the Republican presidency before him, Dwight Eisenhower, no, obviously you have a break with the Great Depression. And before the 30s, Republicans, well, off and on. Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican with active government. But then you get to the 20s and you get Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, and they had a negative view of government. It wasn't so angry. It wasn't anti-government. It was non-government. Then Roosevelt comes in. But when Eisenhower succeeds Roosevelt, the Republican Party made a choice. There was a candidate for the presidency, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio in 1952, who really did want to undo everything Roosevelt had done. And Eisenhower said, no, I don't want to undo it. I don't want to go any further. I want to make it work better. And among the things that Eisenhower pushed through was the interstate highway system, the great expansion of the federal government's role into what it previously been the state. And so then Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, they were in this kind of more consolidation than uprooting. But Reagan, you get another inflection point in 1980 when Reagan beats George Bush for the presidency. And yeah, Reagan did think government did more harm than good. And that, of course, did enormous harm. And we suffered from that. We suffer from it now. Unfortunately, we then went through a period where the Democrats in control, while they differed with Reagan in some ways, they were intimidated by his criticism of government and the success he got. Actually, in American England, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher made government a bad word. So their liberal successors, Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, wanted to have a more positive role, but they couldn't do it head on. And the result of that was that they didn't do enough, because right about that time as well, the economy of the world was changing. Everything was becoming globalized, and American workers were being hurt by the globalization, and English workers in industrial countries. And the prevailing liberal doctrine was, well, let's not do that much to intervene. And I think the combination of government's a bad thing, and then because of that, the government not helping people when they were in economic distress. That's why we got Trump. That's why we get Brexit in England. That's why we got this right-wing surge. And now it is true. People pointed out Donald Trump is no Ronald Reagan. He repudiates much of Reagan. I mean, Reagan was a big free trade guy. Reagan was a foreign policy interventionist. But the common theme is to regard government not as something that can help you, but as the enemy. And that's a kind of vicious cycle for us, because there were things the government should have been doing under Clinton, under Obama, to alleviate the economic distress that globalization is causing. But they were unwilling to do it explicitly. I mean, Clinton made this, and I liked Clinton a great deal, and I think he was a very good president. But one of the worst things any president ever said was when he said in his second term, the era of big government is over. Well, yeah, the era of big government was over at World War II when they stopped with the New Deal stuff. And his saying, okay, we have too much government, in effect, put us way back. We're now just beginning to try to come back there. Joe Biden with a wonderful record of using government's potential. But the problem is that view that starts with Reagan, that government's the enemy, is so deeply entrenched that even as the government begins to adopt policies that are much more helpful to people in distress, they don't react positively.
Wanted to get your opinion on, again, as a consumer of news. It seems that Trump 2016 was another inflection point where instead of where he took that notion of government is the enemy and he took it in a new direction, saying, I will appoint incompetent people to government, in terms of cabinet positions.
Donald Trump boasts about what a great executive he is. Nobody I can think of in an important job has ever appointed so many people that he himself declared were incompetent. There's a new book out by the man who was his first national security advisor, General McMaster, saying, the Wall Street Journal, to its credit, printed an excerpt of this, if we can get last weekend's Wall Street Journal, saying Trump was totally taken in by Putin, that Putin, a terrible man doing terrible things, figured out that if he was flattering to Trump, Trump would go along with anything he wanted. And McMaster kept trying to get him to recognize that Trump was being bamboozled by Putin, and he wound up getting fired by Trump. But his Secretary of State, his Secretary of Defense, his Attorney General, most of the important posts he had filled, he filled with people that he said were incompetent.
Yeah.
But he was also an inflection point ideologically. Before that, you had globalization coming, changing the economy. The Democrats and the Republicans were both for the globalization. The Democrats were trying to do more than the Republicans to help the people being hurt by it, but not nearly enough. So Trump comes in, and he is the first president in the modern era to say globalization is a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And my problem is that was not the right thing to do. What you should do is to accept globalization, which has great benefits, but then use the benefits that come from it to help the people who are being hurt by it. It helps some, and it hurts others. Trump instead did nothing to help the people who were being disadvantaged, but he did get them to blame the government. And he used that anti-government feeling. I guess I would say before Trump, the right-wingers, the conservatives, used their anti-government view as a reason not to do anything. Trump made it into a weapon. It wasn't just that the government should stay out of things. It was that we had to undo all this government because the government did harm people. Now, I am critical of the government during the time I served. I've tried to change this. I do think it is fair to say the liberal Democrats in power didn't do nearly enough to try to buffer people against the economic trends that were hurting them. But it was the economic trends that were doing the problem. In other words, the government wasn't doing negative harm. It just wasn't doing enough good. Trump went a step further and said, "Oh, the government does bad stuff."
Speaking of weaponizing, what are your thoughts on Project 2025?
Oh, I am glad that people are publicizing it. But Donald Trump is for all his talk about authenticity, he is a political weather vane. Look at abortion. This man who 2 years ago was boasting about he was the savior of the anti-abortion movement, now won't even say how he's going to vote on a referendum in Florida where he lives that's going to liberalize abortion. So he's totally backed away from that. And I am struck by the discipline of the right wing that they're letting him do that without too much protest. But it's also true, Project 2025. It was written by people who were Trumpies and who are connected to Trump. And it has, someone showed me the other day, the language in it, which says Trump 47, the Agenda 47. Trump would be the president if he comes back. So clearly, this was a project that was intertwined with the Trump operation. But then when it turned out that some of those things were way unpopular, Trump repudiates it. So I think there are 2 points. First of all, that Trump is being totally disingenuous to claim he's not involved with or that it doesn't represent his administration. It was written by the people he's going to appoint if he wins. And secondly, substantively, it is so extreme that even he had to repudiate it, although he, in fact, helped his people help do it. But I think it's entirely legitimate to look at Project 2025 and say this is this is what's coming if you vote for Trump.
As a transgender woman, I do feel as if a war is being waged against people like me. And so I wanted to sort of go through some of the important bills and legislation that you've been a part of as to how we got to this point. One of the other things that I didn't realize but by reading your book, that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a misapplication of a compromise you suggested.
Oh yeah, was the compromise I suggested was rejected. Actually, the Secretary of Defense at the time, Russ Aspen, tried to sell it, but the Joint Chiefs, it went too far. It would not have done what Don't Ask, Don't Tell did. And then even though Don't Ask, Don't Tell itself was not a good policy, my one criticism of Bill Clinton and all this was that he didn't even give them the protections that would give them. The anti-gay people in the military used Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It was a bad policy. They made it even worse, without question. But look, the problem was that the politics were against us. And at that point, it was the first time that I had disagreements with many of the people in our LGBT community, because they decided the way to do it was just to put pressure on Speaker Pelosi, by far the most pro-LGBT important public official in American history, and me and others, as if it was up to us to say yes or no. Now, our original version included people who were transgender, talking about the discrimination bill, or what we originally wanted to do with regard to LGBT in the military was simply abolish it altogether. In both cases, we didn't have the votes. And instead of helping us get the votes, people got mad at us because we didn't have the votes. And for instance, with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the people who ran the campaign said, we don't want to make a big fight now because people change their mind. And they had the model of an election campaign. And they said, in an election campaign, people will change their mind, the voters. So we're going to wait till the end. Well, that's true of the voters. It's not true of members of Congress. A member of Congress has to take a position early on because people will say, where do you stand on this? So by withholding our effort to persuade people until the end, we waited until it was too late. And we never had the political votes. We put on the floor an effort to have no ban at all. But we got most of the Democrats, but none of the Republicans. And so we lost.
Back in the Clinton administration, the subject of trans people really wasn't something that the public was engaged in
wasn't being
at
brought
all,
up, including trans people.
Right.
Look, here's the model. And what we're dealing with trans people now, I'm more optimistic than many. I think we made great progress and will. Here's the point. I remember I was in the state legislature when Stonewall happened, I was about to be. And when we first started fighting for gay and lesbian rights and bisexual people's rights, we ran into this kind of, oh, that's icky. We don't want to talk about that. And it took a while people came out. And it was people coming out, and then we were able to win. Transgender people were not coming out at that time. Obviously, they faced even greater obstacles and more serious problems. And so the problem is that when we began dealing with the transgender issues in the beginning of the 2000s, in the late 90s, we were at the same stage that the gay and lesbian and bisexual issue was in the 70s. That is, people had to be educated to who these people were. They had to know these were real flesh and blood human beings. They had brothers and sisters and cousins and doctors and patients. And the process really just began later on. And I think there's been great progress. Now, anytime you make progress in any area, you get a backlash. So that, in the 80s and 90s, you got the backlash with regard to LGB, and finally it was overcome. And I think we are in the process of doing that with people who are transgender. Now, there's a very great divide in America. There are states, obviously, where this is problematic, but there are also states, and where I would guess a majority of transgender people either live or want to live, where it's much better, where you have protections you never had before. I mean, we did. Nancy Pelosi, in her new book, mentions, when we passed the hate crimes bill, transgender people were fully included. And in fact, on the floor of the House, I said it was people who were transgender who were more often the victims of bigotry-generated hate crimes. So I think we are going through that same process and we're making progress. But there's always a pushback. And the other thing, too, is people say, well, why, we're still fighting. Yeah, if you're trying to make major social change, you'll always be pushing and you'll always be fighting. But what people may forget is that we're fighting in a better place. I mean, it's to some extent, transgender people started in our own end zone, and we've now, gotten past the 50. With LGBT people, we've about on the 1 yard line. And so no, I think we have to keep fighting. But the essential element was, and it's to the transgender community's credit, there had to be a coming out, a mass coming out. That's what changed it for LGBT people. That is, people came out and bigots suddenly realized that their cousins and doctors and teammates and lawyers and clients and patients, they were those people. And we are in the process of people now seeing that with people who are transgender.
Which is the advice that Tip O'Neill gave you when you were trying to lobby for some of the...
In 1979, said everybody come out because that'll take away the fear of exposure. And but it's also that people are afraid. What I have found is the key is reality defeats prejudice. Defining prejudice as an unrealistic, unfair characterization of people. If people have a view of you that's true, then there's not much you can do about it. If they don't like you, you got to just shrug it off. But with both, in the case of sexual orientation, gender identity, there was a stereotype, and still is, that's totally diverse from reality. And the beginning of dealing with that is to confront people with the reality. And it happened with lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. And the process started later with people with transgender, but we're well into that. And the ability of people to demonize transgender people with this false stereotype has substantially diminished. And I think in 10 years it'll be gone altogether.
But the thing that just amazes me, and I guess it's that people don't study their history, they don't learn from it, is that they're using the same tactics against us that Anita Bryant used in the 70s. This idea that we are out recruiting kids, that what was the way she said that gays can't reproduce, so they recruit. I was speaking at a public library recently, and the Facebook community page lit up with, why are we inviting pedophiles to our library?
Right, and the only way to defeat that is to have people who are transgender, who are manifestly not pedophiles, come out. Now you also do it with pointing out that the overwhelming majority of pedophiles are heterosexual men, and you make the counter argument, but you can't make the counter argument effectively if you don't have the reality on your side. And I think that's what happened. Well, look, marriage is a good example. When they were opposing same-sex marriage in the 90s and early 2000s, they didn't want to just come right out and say, we don't want you to be happy, so you can't get married, because that seemed mean. So they said, oh no, if you let people of the same sex marry, it will undermine heterosexual marriage. That, of course, is nonsense. I said, what you mean? If some guy who's married happily to a woman reads in the paper that I get married to the man I love, he's going to be like, I don't know if you ever saw the old commercials for V8, where there's this drinking tomato juice and orange juice, and then he drinks a V8. Yeah, you're right. He said, oh, I could have had a V8. Just so he's going to see that I have a same-sex marriage. He said, oh, you could have married a guy. Well, what happened was the notion that our being able to marry each other threatened anybody else's marriage was nonsense. But
Yeah.
we couldn't prove it until we decided against the marriages. Massachusetts Supreme Court did it. And by now, opposition to same-sex marriage is a very fringe business. Justice Alito, who represents like the far right of this country, is about the only one. The fact is that reality beat prejudice. Now, that happened with marriage. It happened, by the way, with smoking marijuana. I mean,
Yes.
now because, if people can smoke marijuana, all these terrible things will happen. Well, they haven't happened, so that opposition has ended. And I think that's where we are. So it's important to combat the misinformation, but the prerequisite for being able to combat the misinformation is to have the alternative reality that is the reality, and to have people, and that's why it's important. People say, "Oh, it's symbolic." That's why it's important that President Biden has appointed transgender people to office. Why we will get some transgender people who have been elected to legislature, and then other people who are transgender who are in other ways of making a living or in other professions. The more the public is confronted with the reality that the anti-transgender prejudice is false, the easier it is for us to win.
You appointed, if I'm not mistaken, the first transgender staffer.
And Chaz, who's a great guy, and now works as a kind of political guy for parents and friends of lesbians and gays. In 2009, I hired Diego as my legislative assistant for not just LGBT issues, but health and human services, labor, all of that. And he did a great job. I regret the fact that they, when we lost the House and I retired, people didn't want to pick him up. But that's now been overcome. But yeah, I thought it was very important when we were having these discussions. And I wanted to make sure people knew that Diego had been born a woman and transitioned to being a man. And he's a very able guy, and he's none of the things that people conjure up in their head. And I think he did a lot of good that way in interacting with all the people, including some who probably had prejudicial views.
It also speaks to another one of the major themes in your book, which is, I'm going to throw your own words back at you here. The ideologically and emotionally driven choice of direct action over less dramatic political activity is often counterproductive. You
Yep.
repeatedly argue that incrementalism is not a bad thing.
I want to get as much as I can. 2 points here. First of all, something is almost always better than nothing because it advances the reality. You cannot generally politically get rid of a prejudice all at once. And part of it, given what I say, is you have to show that the prejudice is inaccurate. Okay, on marriage, I'll take this as an example. Some in the LGBT community said if we get married in one state, it's going to be automatically in every state under the Constitution. That was never true under the Constitution, but it wasn't a good political strategy because you would be running into resistance everywhere. The reason we were able to win in marriage, in part, is that in Massachusetts, the Supreme Judicial Court, as it's called in Massachusetts, decided in 2003 to allow same-sex marriage. And it was only after we were able to show in Massachusetts and then one or two other states that there was no negative impact that you could go on and build. So if you look at the same-sex marriage, first we won in Massachusetts, then in a couple other states, Iowa and New York. Then finally in 2012, 9 years after Massachusetts made the decision, for the first time we won referenda in 4 states that were on same-sex marriage, and the dam had broken. And the problem is direct action, sometimes it can work, but very rarely. Demonstrations are useful if they are mobilizing people to take political activity. But politicians make their decisions either on the merits of the case, in which case you don't have to push them, or because they think it's politically more advantageous. demonstrations don't bother them. You know, the March on Washington, Tim McPhilly was president of the Human Rights Campaign Fund. He wrote a very good essay saying that in 1993, we had the March on Washington, and none of the people who came to Washington took the trouble to go to their members of the House and Senate and say, by the way, get rid of the ban on gays. So, yeah, the demonstrations are satisfying. And if they can help motivate people, that's useful. But if you're trying to influence public policy, well, you know, look at the National Rifle Association, which many of us feel had obviously much to influence. Did you ever hear of a shoot-in or a march-in? I mean, they didn't do that. They lobbied by getting their members to talk to their members of Congress. Now, in addition, you make the public stuff, but I don't understand how demonstrations are supposed to work. Again, in 2010, I guess it was just before the election, some woman who'd been involved with marches called a March on Washington for October of 2010. There weren't any politicians in Washington in 2010. That's a month before the election. They're all back in their districts. And they said, well, we're going to put pressure on Congress. I said, no, the only thing you're doing is putting pressure on the grass on the mall where you're gathering. Members of Congress, if they don't hear from their constituents, they don't care who's outside demonstrating.
Your criticism of the '93 march took me by surprise in your book. You saw a few things that day that you felt were working in the other direction.
Somebody decided to have several of the very courageous guys who would come out in the military, 7 or 8 of them, do a can routine for the TV cameras. I was there and said, you guys got to cut this out. And some newspaper, gay paper said, oh, there he was yelling and ranting. Yeah, we are trying to say to people, let these people serve in the military. We're not trying to change the military culture or something. The image of military men in their uniforms emulating French showgirls was not at all helpful. Or the lesbian comedian who said from the stage of the march on C-SPAN, it was being covered, isn't it great to have a first lady I'd like to fuck? Well, and I'll contrast that with the black people. There'd been a black march in Washington. You know, if Red Fox was a funny, obscene black comedian, had talked about having sex with Jackie Kennedy at the March on Washington in 1963, he would have been thrown in the reflecting pool by the organizers. If they had gotten a group of black people to dress up like minstrels, there would have been outrage. And you look at the other groups that are influential, and that doesn't mean you can't speak out. I believe coming out and being public is important. Marching to show that you're there is important. But the notion that by threatening behavior, by being disruptive, you're going to compel the majority that doesn't like you to do things you want them to do has never been true.
That is a discussion, an argument maybe, that goes back to Harry Hay and the Mattachine Society, right? The idea of assimilation versus we're queer, we're here, get used to it.
Well, my view on that is whatever. I think that's separate. The one thing I would say is this: look, if you're going, most people that were going for a job interview, a gay man looking to get a job as a lawyer in a law firm wouldn't go into the interview and do a drag routine, I would think. That doesn't mean drag
one would
is
hope.
bad.
Yeah.
It means that's not the appropriate thing to do in that case. And I'm not, people want to be here, be queer, fine. That's a very important lifestyle. But it is not the best way to change political reality. I can't think of any other organization, any movement that believes that demonstrations and marches and sit-ins are the way to do it. Now, let's make a distinction. People say, well, what about the civil rights movement? Yeah, in the 60s, black people in the South could not vote. The option of pressuring their legislators wasn't open to them.
Right.
But one of the reasons they were doing the disruption was to get the right to vote. And once the Voting Rights Act passed, and once African Americans in the southern states had the same rights to vote, then the demonstrations went away because they had better or effective ways to make their case.
Tangentially related, your career has seen some radical changes in pride celebrations. I mean, in the 70s, it was about survival. In that became more pointed during the AIDS years, of course. And now pride events are something different. They're corporate sponsored, they're community events for the most part. Towns support them. Thoughts on those changes? Are those
A celebration, they become celebrations. I
right?
mean, our parades are now like everybody else's parades. I know there are people who said, well, we want to be different and we don't want to integrate. Fine, go off and not integrate. I do not think that represents most people. I think most people would like to be able to treat like everybody else. But the point about the pride celebrations is they again why is it a bad thing if we have the same opportunities and can enjoy ourselves in the same way as others? Now, if people want to do something different, that's fine. Look, Carnival in Provincetown is clearly different than gay pride parades in Boston, and there's room for both, and I don't see any conflict.
We're coming up rapidly on 40 years of you being out.
Yeah, 1987.
Another quote from your book that just, and this is something I talked with Eric about because it was one of the most important and moving parts of his book for me. You said the strain of living in the closet takes a heavy toll on your personality, and it's hard to keep the anger that should be directed at your own self-denial from spilling over into dealings with others. I experienced that. I didn't come out till I was 55, so I know of that anger. How much better is your life now?
Oh, enormously. I mean, first of all, I'm sitting here talking to you just after my husband came in and combed my hair, and made sure I looked somewhat presentable. The self denial of being in the closet is magnified if you're in the public eye. If you're in a general position where you can keep things relatively private, you can be in the closet and you can have a social life that's separate. But when you're in the public eye, it's very hard to do that. It's very hard to be dating and people will see who you are. So the result was that what I basically chose was to prioritize my public career over my private life. And I found it unsustainable. And by the way, I have seen this. There are other politicians I can think of who were clearly closeted and were, as a partial consequence of that, angrier and nastier. And that's what we're talking about. It's hard to control that. And I've had people say, oh, well, so-and-so doesn't have to come out because he's asexual. I've never met anybody who's asexual. I've never met anybody who didn't have the physical and emotional needs that come from sexual attraction plus affection. And that's clearly what was my problem, because I probably dealt with it by being unwise and patronizing hustlers, and that ultimately caused me some political problems by one who totally misrepresented our relationship, but he was essentially true that I had paid him for sex in our first meetings. And it's very hard. I mean, and it's also the case, the more your job relies on your interaction with other people and involving emotional and deeply felt things, the harder it is to carry that out if you're causing it.
That's a message that I very much want queer youth to hear, that it is impossible to live in the closet long term. Eventually, that stress will get you.
And by the way, let's take an example. I think that is the explanation for the problem of sex abuse in the Catholic Church. You had young men who had gay feelings who were trained and taught to suppress those feelings. And one way to suppress them was to become a priest and to make a virtue out of the fact that you were suppressing them. There are many priests who had gay feelings who were able to become priests and remain celibate, but there were many who couldn't deal with it. Those questions turned out to be strong. And I think that, and as I said, I've seen this a pattern with politicians who are talented, thoughtful people, but are closeted, and there's an edge to their personality that gets in the way. I'll give one example. One of the people are now talking about the fact that former Mayor Ed Koch, the late Ed Koch, Mayor of New York, was gay. And people assumed that at the time or knew it. And Koch was very talented in many ways, but he was also a very angry man and in some ways bullied other people. And there was a very unattractive side to his personality. And I was told by my own colleagues, as I've said, a lot of straight people who are my friends who knew I was planning to come out urged me not to because they thought I would be diminished in influence and they would lose the benefit of my being their ally. But overwhelmingly, after I came out, they said, "Boy, we're glad you did that. You're better at our job now because you're less likely to snap at people. You're more tolerant and compassionate." And again, if your job is just banging nails into a wall, I suppose that's not as important. But in most jobs where interaction with other people is important, crippling yourself emotionally is not a good qualification.
Yeah. I was a teacher for 33 years, and until you got us rights, I could not have come out and had a career in education as a transgender person. That would have been an automatic dismissal.
No question. And as I said, and I know people you said, there's a lot of anti-trans stuff going on, but it is also, in most of the country, it's a lot, trans people are a lot more protected than they were 4 years ago. And that doesn't mean it's perfect, and it doesn't mean people should accept what we have now. But it's a sign, in my judgment, that we're on the same path with trans rights that we were with LGBT rights, and we'll get there.
Want to lead this somewhere, but let me start by asking, when you were in Congress, did you wear a flag lapel pin?
No, because I lose things. I never wear any. I break watches. I lose pins. I am not good with inanimate objects, including keeping track of them. Very lucky that I fell in love with a man who was the opposite. He is enormously talented, and we have a house now. I didn't want to have a house when I was alone because I wouldn't know what to do if something broke. And people say, "Well, you call the guy," and that's a problem. I married the guy. I don't have to call him.
Yeah, you can just call to the next room.
But same with pins. I lose things.
Well, where I was trying to go there is this. I live in a rural town in Connecticut, and daily I am passed by guys in large pickup trucks who are displaying the American flag as a weapon. They are displaying two big old American flags in the back of the pickup bed to send a message that the United States is us, not you. I get that on one level. I'm wondering, though, if we shot ourselves in the foot a little bit with all of the pride flags, that it sets them up to be able to say, well, you're pledging allegiance to a different flag now, so we're reclaiming.
Good point, but there's no reason why you can't do both. By the way, I will say on the pride flag, I am critical of one of the new developments, and that is changing the pride flag to put in all those different colors and triangles. I had always understood that the power of the rainbow flag was that it included everybody.
Yes.
So, well, it includes everybody, but also these people. Among other things, it's ugly. It ruins the aesthetics, and I think there's an infinite number of groups, so you're never going to put them all in. So, but I think both flags are fine. I do think it's one of the things that the Harris Walz campaign is doing. Is the newspapers have noted, the media, that they're reclaiming patriotism. I think people should fly both flags, fly the American flag and the pride flag. We didn't begin to make progress until people started coming out.
Yeah.
A hidden group of people, when I first started crusading among my members, my colleagues in Congress, to do things for gay rights. They say, oh, well, it's not a big deal. The point is because we were hiding, we hid our pain from other people. Decent people who would have sympathized with us didn't know that we were hurting, didn't know that you were feeling oppressed because we never told them. And once we started telling them, a lot of them responded favorably. And the flags are part of saying, hey, no, we're here.
Yeah, I agree.
Racism has been much greater problem in America than transphobia even, and certainly than homophobia. And part of that is that every LGBT person I know has a lot of straight relatives. Very few Black people have that many white fathers and mothers. I mean, there's that lack of that solidarity. But there is one advantage. No 15-year-old Black young woman had to worry about how to break it to her parents that she was Black. They knew. But the pride flag is part of solidarity, and it's a message to each other that we're here. I'm all in favor of that. But I never, well, in fact, I take it back. I'm not dressed now. I'm wearing a T-shirt that says, but I didn't notice this trophy husband. Jim bought us. We each have trophy husband T-shirts. But I do other Zooms. I generally have a dress shirt on. Wouldn't could stand up right now. Wouldn't be right given what I'm wearing. But I wear my suspenders. I have rainbow suspenders.
Oh, wow.
And I always wear my rainbow suspenders. Like I was at getting my driver's license renewed here in Maine, and I was wearing the rainbow suspenders. And one woman in her early 20s, kind of roughly dressed, said, oh, I'm so glad to see that. And she was obviously someone who was suffering from some prejudices against us. So, yeah, no, I don't wear the flag, but I wear my suspenders.
The recent events around the presidential election and President Biden's decision to step aside, the word that I kept hearing in all of the news stories was legacy, that he was ensuring his legacy by doing this. He was risking it by continuing to run. And the opportunity to talk to you, I was wondering what you see as your legacy.
Well, I'm uncomfortable talking about that because you can be either unattractively arrogant or unconvincingly humble. And
go ahead and be both. Go ahead and be both.
I do think the fact that I was in a position where I could come out and still get reelected. You know, a lot of people couldn't have done that. I had a district, although I do think people, including me, overestimated the homophobia at the time. I said in the 80s that I discovered, I think I mentioned this in the book, that I found America to be less homophobic than it thought it was, but more racist than it was willing to admit. But I do think my coming out was helpful. And because I was an influential member of the legislature at the federal level, I was able to make some major changes that I thought about either not earlier than they otherwise would have happened, or maybe would have happened. The financial reform bill that we put through is important. The area that I most regret, I was always pushing for more federal government investment in the construction of housing. And I wasn't able to get very far. I was frustrated. Finally, people now recognize we have a need for that. And I did a few things that helped with that, and I wish I'd been able to do more. I would hope that people on the left who believe in social justice, and ending prejudice, etc., that to some extent I showed them that you can have a practical and positive effect by participating in the system. I believe fully exercising our rights as citizens is the most effective way to vindicate our rights. And I know some people don't think that. And if I wanted to get one thing across from my work, it is to get more people to think that, because obviously the more people that recognize that, the better off we'll be.
That perfectly sets up my last question, sir. And that is that I was listening, I think 2 weeks ago, to David Remnick interviewing Nancy Pelosi. And he asked her about the next generation of leaders and saying that, all of the qualities that you want, which frankly are qualities that you lived during your Congress career, they qualify a person to do a job that pays much better, is much less in the public scrutiny. And so he asked her, well, how do we get the next generation of leaders to buy into the fact that, as you say, government is there to do good for the citizens?
That's a tough question. I wish I had a better answer, but the one thing I know that we should be doing is stress more what government has accomplished. There is a tendency among activists, look, they're never satisfied, they shouldn't be satisfied, but there is a tendency to emphasize the negative. And I guess I'd go to the old song, when you're trying to get people who care and have the right values to implement them in the most effective way, which is through the political process, you got to accentuate the positive and de-emphasize the negative. And, these days, there is no more Mr. In Between. So, but that's, I think with the media, I begin my book, as you know, media with an example of a great success. The use of government to regulate lead in paint and in gasoline, and as a result, brain damage in children, particularly poor children, has dropped by over 90%. We need to, an activist shouldn't just talk about how terrible things are, but say, yeah, things should get better, but they're better than they used to be.
Yeah.
You need two things to motivate people politically. One, a perception that things are bad and should be changed. But equally important is the perception that they can be changed. If you tell people nothing did any good and it's all hopeless, well, they better go out and have a beer than get involved in something that's going to try to make change. And one way to do that, and I wish the media would do more of that, including the gay media, talk about the gains we've made. Don't say that means we don't have to do more. In fact, say that shows you how to do more.
Yeah. We had a hole in the ozone layer, and we managed to address that.
Yeah, acid rain, for those of us who lived in the East, that was a big issue. I haven't heard it talked about unless it was a Prince song that I don't know about.
When I reached out to Congressman Frank, I did it via